those of you who don't know, I'm a really big fan of the Persona series. Actually, if you go on YouTube and scroll way back to my first live section, you'll find that one of the very first things I did on this channel was stream Persona 3 Reload, and please don't go back to watch them, they're really bad. Anyway, with the recent announcement of a remake of Persona 4, I decided to throw my hat into the ring in terms of what kind of things I thought would be needed to improve the overall quality and feel of the game. I really enjoy the Persona 4 games, and while I only have ever played Golden and Persona 5 was my first introduction to the Persona series from a gameplay perspective, Persona 4 was the thing that ultimately brought me into it. That being said, I think there's actually a fair bit of work that needs to be done with these games in order to make them a bit more modern player friendly. So without further ado, here's what I would change in the Persona 4 revival. Now, I want to get the most basic principle out of the way first. This is not going to be a discussion of difficulty. Some people consider the Persona franchise has gotten too easy nowadays, and while I can't necessarily speak on how easy the games have gotten overall, I can say that having gone from Persona 5 to Persona 4 Golden, I didn't really notice a huge increase in the difficulty that a lot of people seem to suggest there was. Maybe that's because I was already familiar with most of the gameplay mechanics, so there wasn't really anything that threw a huge curveball my way, but I will say I didn't notice this drastic difference in difficulty. Maybe things would be more different had I played Persona 3 or 4 originally, but that's kind of where I'm at with it. That being said, I do think that it's important to start with the weakest aspect of the game, the combat system. Persona 4's battles are simple. There's no two ways about it. The combat system revolves around just punching your opponent in the face harder than they punch you, and shadows tend to have very limited movesets. Plus, most of the characters tend to boil down to, I have this magical element and maybe either physical or support skills to supplement. It's not super in-depth or interesting, and is probably the weakest combat across the entire series. So how do we go about addressing all of these issues? Well, the first and most important thing is dealing with balancing the game itself. Most of the time when you're playing a Persona game, they'll typically have either magic or physical being way more overpowered than the other. For example, in Persona 3 Reload, physical skills are just way better than anything magical, both because they can deal critical hits and because there's no real additional system for doing bonus damage with magic short of targeting weaknesses, which isn't really that good because there are also a lot of enemies with physical weaknesses in this game. This leaves magic feeling pretty underwhelming, especially considering that Persona 3 Reload introduced amp and boost skills for physical abilities which weren't in previous games. On the other hand, magic can also be really broken by comparison. Most enemies don't have physical weaknesses in the games after Persona 3, and while there are a handful of enemies that do, more often than not, you're going to be using magic to target weaknesses. Also, magic skills have always had boost and amp attached to them, making it so that they've always been able to boost the amount of damage they can do compared to physicals, which always had to rely on criticals. So how do we bridge the gap between the two? Well, as you probably are going to be seeing a lot in this video, I think it's important to take some notes from Persona 5, and especially Persona 5 Royal, which, get used to that, we're going to be referencing those games a lot in this video. So in these games, they introduced a system that was essentially a magical crit, that being technical damage. The way that technical damage worked was that by targeting specific status conditions, say burn, you would then be able to do bonus damage if you used either a nuke skill or a wind skill, with mental skills being mostly taken up by psychic damage. This was actually a really big buff for status conditions, believe it or not. You see, previously in the franchise, status conditions went mostly underexplored. The main issue facing them was that boss enemies were always immune to them, and they kind of had to be. Their effects were so debilitating that it would be a massive deal if you could inflict it on a boss. But the problem is that most of the little enemies don't have enough HP for status conditions to really matter beyond just hitting them with a weakness. This made them more situational novelties, and were more often than not more detrimental to the player rather than to anybody you would be fighting. But in Persona 5, that was different, as magic could target status conditions to do technical damage, which had the effect of basically functioning like a crit, knocking enemies down and doing bonus damage. I feel like bringing the technical system into Persona 4 Revival would be a really good way of bridging the gap between the two of them. It would put them on a bit more of an even playing field, though you would probably also need to remove boss critical hits, as you can't inflict bosses with status conditions, but having them critical would still make physical inherently better. That being said, I do feel like you might need to tweak the system a little bit, because it was pretty broken in Persona 5 when it was upgraded. In terms of other stuff, I think we're going to see they're more than likely going to add some version of the Baton Pass system that was introduced in Persona 5. Basically, this meant that when you hit a weakness with one character, you could switch to another to keep the chain going and get super easy all-out attacks. This is more than likely going to be added, seeing as it was added to Persona 3 Reload, so I don't think there's much of a reason to get up in arms about it. We're also likely going to get some form of super attacks a la Showtime or Theurgy, so I wouldn't necessarily get your hopes too high if you're expecting this to be on par with the original game's difficulty. That being said, I also want to introduce the concept of changing up the party's movesets a bit. You see, the problem is that Persona 4 doesn't really have a lot of affinities in the game. You've got the basic elements of fire, lightning, wind, and ice, plus light, dark, physical, and almighty. Now this might seem like a decent amount of affinities, but the problem was that most of the characters didn't really have a specialty and kinda classed a little bit into everything. The issue with this, of course, is that the people who actually specialized in something were much better than the all-arounders. Yukiko is probably the best party member in the game because she not only has insanely high magic damage, but she's also got healing on her side. Similarly, Kanji has the best physical damage in the game, and while he can't critical as consistently as Chie, his damage output is almost always going to be higher. But while you do have the two best party members in these two, you also had these guys who were a bit more of a mixed bag. Both of them were incredibly versatile, specializing in a bunch of different things. You see, Naoto could hit every single magical affinity in the game, and while Yosuke didn't have that going for him, he could kind of do a little bit of everything, with wind magic, which nobody else in the party aside from Naoto has, plus having almighty, physical, healing, and evasion buffs, making him pretty well-rounded overall. This did leave them both without a particular niche and being a little bit gimmicky, but ironically, at least for me, I think that worked in their favor rather than against it. Since they don't have a particular niche, you can build them however you want, giving them more flexibility and allowing you to specialize them based on your own choice rather than just being forced to rely on their kit. For example, with Naoto, you could focus on her learning ice skills, which basically made both Teddy and Chie redundant. In Golden, Chie and Teddy both use ice attacks, with Chie having physical on the side and Teddy having support on the side. The problem was that neither of these characters learned anything specific to their own movesets that made them stand out over anybody else, with the exception of Chie being a bit specialized in criticals. Sure, they're the only ice users on the team until you get Naoto, and it's a bike skill, so it comes very late in the game. But the problem was that you could just put ice skills on the protagonist and he could do their jobs better than they could. And since you're always going to have the protagonist and their role is to inherently be a slot filler that can basically do anything whenever it's needed, there's little to no reason to not have ice skills on him at any given time. Pair that with these two having much better damage and these two being much more versatile and able to be filled in wherever needed, it left these two being fairly easily replaceable. Now, to be fair, I think the game is going to have some changes to movesets in general, considering they're likely going to bring in the Koga and Eiga lines of skills, which weren't in the original games. However, I think it would be a good idea to rebalance the movesets in general to give the characters a little bit more flair. For example, what if Teddy instead focused on dark skills? This would allow him to carve out a particular niche in his own type of damage, as well as making it so that Chie's ice magic never felt redundant. This would give both of the characters more flexibility and more of a specific role in the team, rather than having the two of them competing for the same spot. The changes needed would vary a lot based on the different characters, but I feel like it's necessary because balancing the team members would make it so that none of them are easily replaceable or outclass the others super easily like you could see in, say, Persona 3 Reload. With all the combat system out of the way, it's time to focus on some of the other gameplay aspects that I think would need changing, starting with what I consider to be the most fundamental change I want to see outside of the battle system, that being the dungeons. In the original game, the dungeons were a little more than sequentially generated hallways that would randomize a little bit and had different texture packs. But whether you were in the castle, the hot springs, or the underground lab, there really wasn't much of a difference between the area outside of maybe 1 or 2 floors per dungeon that was unique. And even then, it was essentially just run around until you found the enemy you need to defeat. So how do we change these locales? Well, I think the biggest way to do that would be to make them much more distinct and focus on the individual character. Which means once again we're going to be copying Persona 5's homework. Now, obviously, narratively, palaces are different from dungeons, as palaces are considered areas where the ruler has complete dominion based on their warped perception of reality. However, I think Persona 4's dungeons should go for a similar approach. The character's mental state very clearly shapes the world, and thematically, they're similar to palaces, even if not 100%. I think that giving the dungeons a unique flair that matches the character's actual vibe and what their shadow is going for is a much stronger narrative choice than just giving us Hallway Simulator for another game. Okay, look, I understand why this wasn't in Persona 4. When Persona 4 came out, the franchise was still very much in its infancy and had just undergone a major renaissance. And having a lot of these specific things in them, it would have taken a lot of time and effort and specific changes to the formula they had just established that I think it wouldn't have been feasible at the time of release. That being said, a lot has happened since the original release of Persona 4, and at least for me, I would really prefer to see something distinct rather than essentially just the same area over and over again. But that does raise an important question. What is the player supposed to do about the grind? I pressed the wrong button. One of the unique things about Persona 4's dungeons is that they could be revisited in order to get personas from that area or to train up after you've completed the dungeon. There would also be mini-bosses on the top floor that you could use to boost your social stats or just take on an extra challenge. However, I would argue this could be done by creating a sort of reverse Inaba situation. Now, I have played this game. I have gotten to the end. I know what happens. I'm not going to get into spoilers. But I do think it would be a good idea to introduce something like Mementos or Tartarus so that we can still have a training area without sacrificing the unique potential that each dungeon brings. But even if there isn't something like this in the game, I still feel like you could bridge the gap a little bit between the two of them by making it so that the dungeons are a lot more open after you visit them the first time. Think a door that is closed when you first visit the area, but then you come from the other side and unlock it. This would allow the dungeons to have unique layouts, puzzles, and traps, while not removing their potential for revisiting or for grinding down the line. Alternatively, you could just create a hub world that unlocks more and more powerful enemies the further into the game you get. Look, I'm not saying I want it to be Mementos 2.0, but I would rather have that than Tartarus 2.0 or an entire game. Now let's talk other mechanical changes that I deem necessary. Let us start with this man. If you know who this is and you know how to start their social link, you have either played this game for much too long or you have recently completed it. There is no in between. And he's also emblematic of probably the biggest issue that I have with this game. Persona 4 encourages a lot of exploration, backtracking, and talking to random people at random times in random locations to get things going. I am not exaggerating when I say that I will regularly have a guide open to complete this game just so I know how to progress the story. And that's not even counting all the social links or other things that are just out of the way that you would have no reason to explore and you specifically knew what you were looking for. Simply put, the game needs some sort of hint system to indicate that certain characters or locations or events are more important than others, beyond just having character portraits floating over their heads. That being said, I do think this is a change we are likely to see, especially since Persona 3 Reload showed tarot cards over top of important locations or social links. But I think this is a change that is much more desperately needed in this case. Look, it's not the most essential change to the game, and I know I mentioned that there are strategy guides that exist for this exact reason, but the problem is that the Persona games are so heavily time intensive that you could very easily miss certain things because they aren't spelled out for you well enough. And this is an especially big problem because this game already wastes a lot of your time, and its distribution of social links is really not great. I mean, just take a look at the difference between the daytime and the nighttime confidants. One of the major issues I had playing through Persona 4 Golden and Persona 3 Reload was that nighttimes especially felt very empty. Persona 4 Golden is better in this regard because it does have a few nighttime links rather than just the two that Persona 3 Reload had, but a lot of the time, your nights would essentially be spent either building up social stats or finishing the 4 social links that there were to deal with. but once you finished them, there wasn't really much that you needed to do with your nights. Which is a bit of a problem because there are a lot of social links to progress during the day, and the weather system in this game made it so that certain social links were regularly unavailable, making them much harder to complete. Pairing this with having difficult to figure out quest lines and hard to figure out locations, especially for certain arcana like the Fox, this meant that you could very easily lose track of time or miss 100% completion just because you didn't know where to go or when you're going to run out of time. Okay, granted, yes. It is very important for you as the player to be watching the weather system and to prioritize your time. The game incentivizes you to do that from the beginning, and it's a core part of the series. And yes, there are plenty of times across all of the games that you're going to miss out on certain days and won't be able to use them for social links. This could be because of cutscenes, dungeons, or any number of different things. But the problem with Persona 4 especially is that you can still technically do stuff on these days. Like, it's raining outside, but you can still technically progress certain social links. I would high-key recommend saving the Fox for these days, by the way, but that's an aside. Anyway, the reason that I don't like this is because it feels like it artificially robs the player of choice rather than doing something organically like you see with the cutscenes. Finally, if there's one last recommendation that I would have for the game, that would be the decision to include any of the golden stuff. Now, considering how Persona 3 Reload was, I'm willing to bet that if anything, Golden would be planned to be an additional DLC. However, I don't think that's really the way to go in this particular context. The reason that I say this is that Persona 4 Golden is too big to be a DLC and doesn't really function like the answer. It's not an after story that canonically takes place after the events of the main game. It's an entirely separate playthrough with a bunch of different changes. The biggest of which being the inclusion of Marie. Marie is spread out across the entirety of Persona 4 Golden, so she's not a simple side story that could be done after the main game like The Answer. It's an entirely different playthrough. For this reason, I think a lot of Golden implementations should be put into the game from the start. Stuff like having the Shrine Offering box can somewhat offset the feeling of having nights being very useless once you've completed the social links. It can also somewhat help mitigate the issues that I had about the weather system, feeling like you just lost a day for no good reason. Additionally, I do feel like a lot of the implementations that Persona 4 Golden made to character movesets would be great additions to what we've got overall. But I do think some of them should just be part of their base skills, like give Yukiko Concentrate, don't make it her 5th bike skill. I also just want to see Marie in the game. Maybe it's because I played Persona 4 Golden exclusively, but I didn't really find her inclusion to be all that problematic or jarring, and I actually enjoyed her character. Maybe you could get rid of the Valentine's Day scene with her, or rather make it not mandatory, but I also think it would be really cool to potentially see her as an additional party member, maybe focusing on light skills. I think I just want to see her playable in something that isn't the fighting game. And for the record, Marie isn't even my favorite character in this game because that is Yukiko. And there you have it. These are the changes that I would recommend for Persona 4's revival. What do you guys think about these changes? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd also be really curious to see what sort of things you would change given the opportunity. With all that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.